And let's jump into our notes. So here we are, week 6 of biology class, and we are going to be talking about the special types of diagrams called cladograms. Oops, that's not what I wanted. This is stuff from earlier class, so we can get rid of some of this. All right, so there is a whole section of biology. There's a whole group of scientists whose entire job and entire goal it is to study how organisms are related to each other. So their whole goal is to try and figure out which organisms belong in which groups. So like what makes an organism being able to put into the cat group versus the dog group? What makes something a fern versus a flowering plant versus a tree? All of this type of study is called cladistics. So a method of classifying animals and plants by the characteristics they have in common. So the idea is that the more similar that two organisms are, the more closely related that they are. So for example, a house cat is pretty closely related to a lion, right? They both fall into like the big or the cat group of the evolutionary tree. They both have paws and claws that are shaped in similar ways. Their body structure is more or less the same, just kind of on a different scale. And so that makes them very, very closely related. So cats aren't super closely related to dogs, but they're both still mammals. They both are on 4 legs. They both have fur and 2 eyes and 2 ears. And so they're kind of closely related to dogs. They're not super closely related to birds, but they do still have some things in common. So cats and birds have backbones and have bones and muscles inside of their body, right? They're multicellular organisms. They both live on land, so they use lungs for breathing. And then cats and bugs, like insects and spiders and stuff, are very, very much not related, right? Insects don't have any bones. They don't have fur. They give birth to their young in eggs for the most part. And so there aren't very many similarities between let's say like a spider and a cat versus a cat and a dog. So because cats and dogs have some things in common, they're a little bit more closely related than some other species. And that's kind of what cladistics is all about. It's all about trying to group organisms based on characteristics that they share. So a cladogram is it's sort of like a family tree, if you will, kind of like those pedigrees that we were looking at earlier in the term. This is kind of like that, but for evolution, not just for one single family. So a cladogram is this diagram that's shaped like a tree like this that shows evolutionary relationships. And the idea is that the closer together that two organisms are, the more recently they diverged from a common ancestor. So, for example, humans and chimpanzees, who is our closest animal relative, we had a fairly recent common ancestor, maybe from 1 or 2 million years ago, whereas humans and lynx, which is like a type of cat, had a mammal common ancestor from probably 100 or so million years ago. And humans and lizards had a vertebrate common ancestor from a couple hundred millions of years ago, and so on and so forth. So all of these things are related just by the fact that they are animals that are living on Earth. But the closer together that they are on the chart, the more similar that they are versus other organisms later on. So this is a cladogram. It shows how closely related two organisms are in terms of the evolutionary type sense. So there is a lot of information going on in a cladogram. So the first thing that I'm going to do for you guys is kind of break down how to read it, how to look at what does this line and these lines mean? What are all these little individual parts mean? So a cladogram works kind of like a tree, if you will, where we have some sort of base of the tree and then all of these branches that are branching off of the tree. These branches represent organisms. They represent plants or animals that had some sort of common ancestor long, hundreds of millions of years ago. So you can think of a common ancestor as being kind of like the base of the tree. So our four descendants up here, our four different species, are all different species that branched off from this common ancestor tree. So we have some sort of ancient ancestor at the base, and then as we move forward, we get more and more recent common ancestors in our tree. So the further down the tree that you are, it means the longer ago your branch branched off from this kind of evolutionary path right here. So we have four different species. These are all species that are living on Earth today, right? So it's not like these are guys that went extinct in the past. We still have lampreys and sharks and newts that are alive on Earth today. But the fact that they're closer to the base of the tree means that they branched off from this common ancestor longer ago than things like lynx and chimpanzee and humans. These guys had a more recent branching off point. So here we have a slightly different cladogram. We have A, B, and C. So again, A, B, and C are all three different organisms, three different animals or plants currently living on Earth. And they all have characteristics that are unique to them, right? So the big thing that a cladogram does is that it groups organisms based on traits and characteristics that they either do or don't have. So at one point, we all had some common ancestor. And then some organisms, B and C, developed a new trait that A did not have. So A was sort of the first branching off trait. It didn't get that new trait. And then B and C branched off from each other when C developed a new trait that B did not have. So they have some sort of common ancestor. And then as we develop more and newer traits, we have these organisms that branch off. So like if we go back to our example, we had some sort of common ancestor. And then some of the species that branched off from it developed jaws. But the ones that did not ended up becoming our lamprey, our like weird kind of eel type fish things. And that's our species A. And then we had we have another common ancestor, and then some species developed lungs, but other ones like sharks and fish did not. So they were our next ones that branched off. So as we go up the cladogram, we end up with more and more and more traits that separate the further down species from the ones lower on the diagram. So everywhere that you see this kind of branch point, like on this one, there's one right here and one right here. That indicates where the most recent common ancestor for those species are. So for example, our first branch right here, our first split, we had some sort of common ancestor of A, B, and C. So some sort of ancient organism that A, B, and C are all related to. And then one group broke off and ended up developing into A, and another group broke off and would develop into B and C later on. So then we have another common ancestor. So our B and C meet right here. This is the common ancestor of B and C. So then they broke off to become two different species as well. So if you think about it on our example here, let's start here. So we have some sort of common ancestor of lizards and lynx and chimpanzees and humans. One of its descendants develops hair, and the one that doesn't develops into lizards. So the species that all have hair now have this common ancestor. So now we have a common ancestor of lynx and chimpanzees and humans. One of those branches lost their tail, and the ones that didn't became lynx. So now we have chimpanzees and humans that both don't have any tails, and so their common ancestor was somewhere around here. And then humans developed the ability to be bipedal, meaning that we could walk on 2 feet instead of 4. But the organisms that would become chimpanzees did not. And so that caused a split between us. So whenever you want to find a common ancestor between two species, you have to find where their branches intersect. So for example, if you want to know the last time that chimpanzees and newts had a common ancestor, you'd have to look at where the chimpanzee line and the newt line meet up, and it would be right here. So this branch would eventually develop chimpanzees, and the other branch develops newts. So this organism down here, whatever it used to be, represents the last time that chimps and newts had the same common ancestor. I know this is kind of confusing at first, and so I'm trying to kind of describe it in little bits and pieces. But is there anything that anybody is still really confused about or really not sure about with these cladograms? Anything that is still not making much sense?
Can you actually explain the other diagram that you were showing again?
This one?
Yeah.
So at some point, hundreds of millions of years ago, A, B, and C were all one organism, one animal. And so they all had a single common ancestor millions and millions of years ago. B and C, the animal that would eventually become B and C. So some of the descendants from this common ancestor would become species A, and some of them would develop different traits, new traits, and become species B and C. So we had this one common ancestor from millions of years ago, and then one of its descendants branched off and became A. Another one of its descendants would become the common ancestor of B and C. So up until this point right here, B and C were the same organism. But then something happens, something causes the split between these two species. And so we end up developing B is one species, and C becomes a different species. And so while they are all related to the same organism hundreds of millions of years ago, B and C were both related to the same organism tens of millions of years ago, and now they've developed into their own species. So these points on the cladograms where we have these branches, where we have these kind of branching meeting points, these represent a single common ancestor for all of the species that would later branch off. So A, B, and C have a common ancestor right here. Then B and C have a more recent common ancestor right here. It's kind of like if you think about us, chimpanzees, and dogs. Us, humans, chimpanzees, and dogs all had the same common ancestor hundreds of millions of years ago. It was sort of the ancestral mammal that had 4 limbs, a backbone, it had hair, it gave birth to live young. These are all things that all chimpanzees, dogs, and humans do. But then dogs would become their own group, and chimpanzees and humans both developed from primates. So from like monkeys and apes and stuff like that. So chimpanzees and humans have a more recent common ancestor than we do with dogs, because we share more similar traits, and we are more closely related. So because we're more similar to chimpanzees than we are to dogs, we have more traits with them than dogs. That means we have a more recent common ancestor. But there are still some traits that all humans and chimpanzees and dogs share. We're all mammals. And so that means that we still have a common ancestor, but it was just further back in the past. So again, the closer together two species are, the more closely related that they are. And in general, the name of the species that's the first to branch off, that's the least like all the other ones, is called the outgroup. So in the case of comparing dogs and chimpanzees and humans, dogs would be the outgroup. They are least similar to all of the other groups that are in our cladogram. All right, what else are people confused with cladograms? Is there anything about these that still is super confusing or doesn't make a lot of sense to you? All right. So even if it is still a little bit confusing, I'll take you guys through a bunch of examples, and maybe that'll help kind of clear things a little bit. No problem, Ashley. Thanks for the question. So we are going to practice reading a cladogram here. Here we have a pretty basic cladogram that takes us from a lancelet, which is like a super tiny fish type thingy that lives in the ocean, all the way up to a big complex vertebrate like a leopard right here. So our different traits that separate out our groups are having a vertebral column, so meaning that you have vertebrae in your spine, having jaws that help you move your mouth around, having 4 legs that you walk on, having an amniotic egg, which just means that you have extra protections around the eggs that you make, and having hair. Those are our traits. So we'll start by talking about some of these traits down here. So what trait separates lampreys from tuna on this cladogram? What was the trait that caused the tuna group to split off and be different from the lamprey group?
Was it the jaws, or was it the?
Exactly. So lampreys and tuna, let's find their most recent common ancestor. Let's see, follow their lines down. So here we go. This is the last time that lampreys and tuna were the same ancestor. And then tuna and all of their descendants developed jaws, but lampreys did not. So that is the trait that separates lampreys from tuna. Lampreys do not have jaws, but according to this cladogram, tuna fish do. All right, similar question. What trait separates a salamander from a turtle? So which trait does the turtle have that the salamander does not have?
The egg one. I don't know how to say the first one.
Amniotic egg is how you say that word. So yeah, salamanders are here, turtles are here. So this is where they branched off from each other. Salamanders do not have an amniotic egg, but turtles do. That's the thing that separates the guys up here from the guys over here. So that special type of egg. Salamanders do not have it, but turtles do. All right, number 3. Which organism is most related to the leopard?
The turtle.
The turtle. Exactly. Turtles and leopards are way over here on the end. They are close together on the cladogram, and we can see right here that they have a fairly recent common ancestor compared to all these other guys on the list. So leopards are most closely related to turtles because the further down that you go, the less and less related that they are. All right. So Ashley's been doing a lot of the heavy carrying so far. So Samyan, Nasima, Elizabeth, time to wake up. What are the 4 traits that turtles and leopards share? So based on this cladogram, what are the 4 things that turtles and leopards have in common?
The 4 walking legs.
They both got 4 legs. If you're a turtle or you're a leopard, you have 4 legs. So that's 1 check. Very good. What else? Some of the other ones. Nasima or Samyan, do you guys have any ideas?
The
end of animal. I don't know the names, but they have like that little.
All right. So we have the animals up here, but the traits that we're talking about are from down here. So based on just this cladogram right here of the turtle and the leopard are here at the end. And I want to know, what are the 4 traits that turtles and leopards have in common? So Elizabeth already picked out 1. She picked out they both have 4 legs, 4 walking legs. So that's 1 trait. What are some of the other traits that turtles and leopards have in common?
Could it be the jaws?
They both have jaws, exactly. So jaws is one of the traits that they both share. So they've got legs, 4 of them. They've got jaws. We got 2 more.
The amniotic egg.
Amniotic egg, that is something that turtles and leopards share. So they have the same type of egg. They have 4 legs. They have jaws. What is our last trait that they share?
The
verbal.
So what was that?
The verbal colon.
Yeah, the vertebrae.
The vertebrae.
Vertebrae. Exactly. Yep. So because turtles and leopards have this as their common ancestor, the cladogram tells us that they both have a vertebral column. They both have jaws. They both have 4 legs. And they both have an amniotic egg. So based on this cladogram, the only difference between turtles and leopards is that leopards have hair, while turtles do not. So that is what a cladogram tells us. If you look at an organism, you can see all of the traits that it shares with the organisms that it was related to in the distant past. And you can see the trait that separates it from the more recent organisms. So for example, our salamander here, salamanders, along with turtles and leopards, share a vertebral column and jaws and 4 walking legs. So that's what's similar between salamanders, turtles, and leopards. But salamanders do not have an amniotic egg and they do not have hair. So in order to figure out the traits that organisms had in the past, you look at what traits were present in their common ancestor. So what traits did they have before they diverged with the more recent species? All right, very nice job. Thank you, guys. Anybody have any questions on cladograms in general or this particular cladogram so far? Any of these questions where you're still not really sure where the answers came from? All right, let's look at another example that's set up in kind of a similar way, but uses a little bit different species. So here we have some different species. We have sharks, ray-finned fish, amphibians, primates, rabbits, crocodiles, and birds. So this one is set up a little bit differently. We have some different traits and some different common ancestors going on here. So the first thing I want to know about is which trait separates amphibians, to this guy here, from primates on this cladogram.
Is it the hair?
Hair is one of them. So primates have the trait of hair, amphibians do not. Are there any other traits that separate primates and amphibians?
Could it be the eggs with the shell?
Mm-hmm. Not close, right? Because remember, primates are over here, and so primates do not have eggs with shells, but they do have a different kind of egg.
The amniotic egg, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So if we look at amphibians and primates, if we follow the evolutionary lines here, here is the last common ancestor of amphibians and primates. So they both have vertebrae, bony skeletons, and forelimbs. But primates and other related organisms up here developed amniotic eggs, and in the case of these guys, hair, whereas amphibians did not. And so, based on this recent common ancestor, we can see that amniotic eggs were the first trait that split off this later groups from the amphibians, and hair specifically separated these two guys from the amphibians. All right, nice job so far. So up next, what traits separate rabbits and primates from crocodiles on this cladogram?
The hair?
Hair is one of them. So primates and rodents have hair, whereas crocodiles do not. What else separates crocodiles from primates and rodents?
The amniotic egg? No?
Not right. The amniotic egg is back here. And if we look at primates and rodents and crocodiles and follow their paths meet up at this ancestor.
So the egg with the shells.
Hey, there you go. Exactly. So this ancestor does have an amniotic egg. It's already been developed before this ancestor. But this ancestor does not have hair, and it does not have eggs with shells. So primates and rodents and rabbits have hair, which crocodiles do not. But crocodiles have eggs with shells, which primates and rodents do not. So these are two traits that are different between these groups. All right. Which organism is most related to birds on this cladogram?
Would it be the crocodiles since they're so close together?
Exactly. So birds and crocodiles are closer related than birds are with any of the other groups here. And just like you said, it's because they're closely related. So it's not just because they're close on the cladogram, but it's also because their recent common ancestor was way up here. And remember, on a cladogram, the further down that you are, the further back in the past, the further up you go, the more recent. So because this split is way up here, that means that birds and crocodiles are the most closely related to each other compared to all the other ones. This isn't written down on here, but I want to throw another one here at you to switch it up a little bit. Which organism is most closely related to rabbits on this cladogram? So if our rabbit is right here, what is the most closely related organism?
Primates?
Primates.
Right.
Exactly. That is correct. Again, on this case, just the way that the cladogram is set up, the rabbit is close to the picture of the primate and the crocodile. But if you look at the diagram, you can see that rabbits and primates, things like monkeys and apes, have a very recent common ancestor way up here. Much more recent than the common ancestor of rabbits and crocodiles, which is way down here. All right, so again, it's all about finding those common ancestors based on where they branch off on the cladogram. And you can use these different traits, these different characteristics, to kind of separate out your groups. Say which groups share lots of characteristics and which groups do not. All right, very good, very nice. Thank you for your help. So it's really great to be able to read and understand our cladogram. But the other thing that scientists like to do is create cladograms, come up with their own sets of diagrams. So if we want to create a cladogram for a set of organisms, the first thing that we have to do is identify their characteristics. So here we have 4 different organisms. We have a lamprey, that weird eel-y kind of fish thing. We have a snapping turtle, a big turtle with a fierce bite. A tuna fish, and a bullfrog, the ribbit variety. And so the first thing that we do when constructing a cladogram is look at the characteristics that they share or don't share. So here we have some characteristics. We have a nerve cord, like your spine. We have paired legs. We have a vertebral column. So your nerve cord is like your spinal cord, the actual nerves that are along your back. And then your vertebrae, your vertebral column, is like your actual bones, the backbones that protect the nerve cord. And amniotic sac or amniotic egg, just like that example from earlier. So the first thing that we have to do is figure out which characteristics go with what. So all 4 of these guys have a nerve cord. These are all types of vertebrate animals, which means that they have a nerve cord along their back. If we think about paired legs, snapping turtles have legs that are in pairs, and bullfrogs have legs that are in pairs, but lampreys and tuna fish, they live in the ocean. So they do not have paired legs. They don't have any legs. They have fins instead. Vertebral column, so an actual backbone, our lamprey is missing it, but everybody else has one. And then finally, our amniotic sac. Snapping turtles have an amniotic sac, but none of these other groups do. They're all missing it. They all make the kind of simpler, more basic type of eggs. So once we figure out which characteristic goes with which organism, we then have to go around setting up our cladogram. So here is a sort of basic cladogram. We have our 4 organisms right here. And a good place to start with the cladogram is the outgroup, the organism that is the least similar to all the other groups on the cladogram. And so when you have a chart like this, a good way of finding the outgroup is finding which animal, which organism has the least number of shared characteristics. Which organism has the least number of characteristics that some of the other animals do. So a good way to do this is to count out of these 4 characteristics that we came up with, how many does each animal have? So if you look down our columns here, you can see that lampreys only have the 1, snapping turtles have all 4, tuna fish have 2, and bullfrogs have 3 out of 4. So if we're going to construct our cladogram up here, which organism has the fewest characteristics? Which one is least similar to all the other ones?
The lamprey.
Yep, our lamprey only has 1 out of all of these characteristics. All the other guys have more than 1 shared characteristic. So lamprey is going to go in our first box right there. And I actually thought I had it written in there, but it looks like I don't. But I might be able to write it in here. So let's see if we let this guy go up and we make this guy. Oh, I guess I can't make this any smaller. All right. Oh, I forgot. There's a weird way you have to do it in here. There we go. All right. Lamprey is our first organism, the least similar. So as we go up our cladogram, we're going to fill in from the fewest number of traits to the most number of traits. So lamprey only had 1 trait. He was the least similar, so he goes at the very beginning. Which organism has the next fewest number of traits?
It would be the tuna. Can I say the other ones, or should I wait?
Hold on,
Like-
wait
Okay.
for a second. So let me fill in this guy. Tuna goes in there. All right, so lamprey only had one shared trait, so he went on the first one. The tuna had two shared traits right here. Oh, you guys can't. Oh, it disappears when I do that. The tuna had two shared traits right here and right here. So he's up next. So lamprey has one, tuna has two. What is our next organism going to be? What's the next organism with the smaller number of traits? Ashley, you can go ahead. Hey, Elizabeth got it as well. Bullfrog. The bullfrog has three of the traits that we talked about. And so he is up next. And then finally, the one remaining guy over here, our most number of traits organism is our, I don't think snapping turtle is going to fit in there. So I'm just going to write turtle. So this is our cladogram. Our lamprey over here only has the nerve cord. Our tuna right here has the nerve cord and the vertebrae. Our bullfrog has the nerve cord, the vertebrae, and paired legs. And then finally, the turtle has all four of those traits. He has the largest number of different traits. So that is how you construct a basic cladogram like this. You figure out how many shared characteristics do each organism have, and then put them in the cladogram from fewest number of shared characteristics to most number of shared characteristics. All right, so let me see if this next example works a little bit better. All right. So here we have another chart, but this one is flipped a little bit. So now we have the organisms over here on our left-hand side, and the traits up here at the top. So once again, we figure out which traits go with which organisms. So a lynx, for example, kind of similar to a bobcat, it has hair, and it has an amniotic membrane, and it has lungs. A chimpanzee has hair, lungs, a membrane, and it also does not have a tail. Lizards do not have hairs. They do have tails, but they have a membrane and lungs. Newts have lungs, but they don't have anything else. And humans walk on two legs. They have hair. They don't have tails. They have a membrane around their egg. And they do have lungs. So sometimes you'll see cladograms that look like this. And on this one, they label up all the X's down at the bottom. But that no longer tells you how many characteristics that a specific animal has. Instead, it tells you how many animals share this particular characteristic. So we can't base our cladogram on these numbers down here anymore, because they're just telling us how many animals are bipedal, how many animals have hair, how many animals don't have a tail. Whereas what we want to know is how many traits does a lynx have? How many traits does a newt have? How many traits does a human have? So we're going to have to do a little bit of counting on our own. So if we were making a cladogram where we're going from fewest number of traits all the way up to the most number of traits, which organism is going to be on the very first box on our cladogram? Which one is going to start it off?
Can you repeat the question, please?
So if we were making a cladogram just like we did before, so just like this one that we were just looking at, which organism is going to go in that first box on the cladogram? What is our least similar, our most simple organism?
Would it be the newt?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Again, we can't really use these numbers down here anymore to count. So instead, we just have to look across each organism. And newts only have one shared characteristics. They only have lungs, but none of this other stuff. So newt would be our first organism. So newt is up first. It's our most simple, our least similar. Which organism then would be our second? What would be our second least similar organism? The second.
The lizard.
Mm-hmm. Lizards have 2 of these 5 characteristics. They have lungs and a membrane, but that is it. So lizards would be up next. What would go in our number 3 spot? What would be our third most simple organism? Third most unrelated.
The lynx.
Mm-hmm. Lynx has 1, 2, 3 traits. That's more than the lizard and the newt. So lynx would go next. Finally, what would go in the 4th box? What would be the 4th next one?
The chimpanzee.
Mm-hmm. Chimpanzee would go 4th because it has the next most number of shared characteristics. It has 4. And finally, that leaves human as number 5. So our final filled in tree cladogram would look like this. Our newt only has the 1 shared trait, so he's way over here at the very beginning of our cladogram. He is our out group. Humans have the most number of these shared derived traits, so humans go at the very other end of our cladogram. And then we fill in from fewer number of traits to more number of traits. Lizards have 2 of the 5 traits. Lynx have 3 of the 5. Right, 1, 2, 3, yeah. And chimpanzees have 1, 2, 3, 4 of the 5 traits. So I wanted to show you guys an example like this because sometimes the table gets flipped. Our first one that we looked at had the organisms across the top and the traits down the side. This one had the traits across the top and the organisms down the side. But no matter how your chart is set up, you still build the cladogram the same way. You look at the traits you figure out which organism has the fewest number of traits, and that is your beginning point. And then you go, okay, who has the next fewest? And then the next fewest, and then the next fewest, and then who has the most? And that will be your ending organism, the organism at the top of your cladogram. All right, thank you for helping me out fill in that cladogram right there. Does anybody have any questions on the cladograms so far? Any way that we were filling in this diagram right now where you're still a little bit confused about where we were getting some of this information from? All right, so hopefully you feel pretty okay with how to read and how to set up cladograms, because that is essentially what you're going to be working on for your daily assignment for today. So in these practice problems, some of them I'm giving you a version, a type of a cladogram, and asking you some questions about it. And then the last one, I'm having you make a cladogram of some basic organisms that I'm giving you. So the first two questions regard this particular cladogram right here. And so this one is kind of basic. It just has the different species numbered. And it wants to know about who is species 2 most related to, and who would the outgroup be on the cladogram. This is a little bit different version of a cladogram. Sometimes cladograms are put on their side like this because it makes it easier to read all of the names of the different species. These are different apes, I believe, or monkeys, different primates. So it's put on its side, but it acts the exact same way as a normal cladogram. The species that are more recently, more further, in this case, it's not up, but it's to the right. The species that are more recently linked together are more closely related. And the species that are further apart are less likely related. So again, same idea, same way of reading it, but it's just presented a little bit differently. It's flipped on its side versus instead of being that kind of branching one that we were looking at earlier. Here we have another kind of funky looking cladogram, and it's asking about species C and species E. Which one of these numbers represents their common ancestor? So we're looking for where C and E join up together. And then finally, we have something that should hopefully look pretty familiar to you at this point. So we have some different types of plants, mosses, pine trees, flowering plants, and ferns. And we have some traits: vascular tissue, flowers, and seeds. And it's represented with a 0 or a 1 if the plant has it or it doesn't. So for example, ferns have vascular tissue, but they do not have flowers and they do not have seeds. So based on this little table right here, which again should hopefully look a little bit similar to what we were doing today, I want you to make me a cladogram. So fill in A, B, C, and D on the cladogram and on our little diagram down here, With which one of these do you think represents mosses? Which one represents pine trees? Which one represents flowering plants? And which one represents ferns? And so you'll match the name of the plant with where it should go on the cladogram. So some little bit tricky questions, but they're all multiple choice and they're all based on the principles that we've been talking about in class here tonight. All right, so does anybody have any questions, any final questions about the cladogram homework or anything about these weird and wacky diagrams that we've been talking about so far today? Anything that you're still a little bit confused or still not sure about when it comes to cladograms?
I'm confused on that. I just came in from the class.
Yep, I know. I saw that you just got in here. Thanks for popping in.
Can you kind of explain more on this?
Yeah, for sure. If you want, once we finish up class tonight, I can give you kind of a quick rundown of everything that we talked about if you think that'll be helpful.
Okay, that's fine.
All right, cool. Let's see. Oh, I know what I was gonna do.